My brother showed up at my restaurant. I was elbow deep in prep work, flour on my apron, hair pulled back under a bandana, and absolutely no patience for surprises. My sous chef knocked on the kitchen door and said there was a man out front claiming to be family. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked out, and there he was. My brother standing in the middle of the dining room I had built from nothing, looking around like he was touring a museum. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because 7 years ago, my father sat across from me at the kitchen table in the house I grew up in and told me that pursuing culinary school was the stupidest thing he had ever heard of. He said I was throwing my future into a garbage can. My mother didn't say a word. My brother, who was sitting right there eating a sandwich, just shrugged and said, "She's always been dramatic." That was the last meal I ever ate in that house. Let me go back to the beginning because the beginning matters. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. My father worked in insurance. My mother taught elementary school part-time and spent the rest of her energy managing the family image, which mostly meant making sure everything looked fine from the outside even when it wasn't. My brother was 3 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand how attention worked in our house, I understood that he got more of it. He played football. He got decent grades. He was loud in the way my father respected, certain, direct, never second-guessing himself. I was quieter. I drew pictures in the margins of my notebooks. I spent weekends watching cooking shows and trying to recreate dishes in our kitchen on Sunday afternoons when everyone else was watching football. My mother would come into the kitchen sometimes and taste whatever I made and say it was good, but she said it the way you compliment a child's drawing. Warmly, dismissively, already moving on. My father never tasted anything I made. Not once. Not in 18 years of living under his roof. When I was 16, I won a regional cooking competition through my high school. First place, there was a small write-up in the local paper. I brought it home and set it on the counter where my father would see it. He glanced at it, nodded once, and turned back to the TV. My brother made a joke about how cooking was a good skill for a wife to have. Everyone laughed. I picked up the newspaper clipping and carried it back to my room and taped it to the inside of my closet door, where only I could see it. That was when I started understanding what I was working with. I applied to culinary school my senior year of high school, a 2-year program in Pittsburgh with a strong placement rate. I also applied to Ohio State because my father expected it, and I got into both. When the culinary school acceptance came, I made the mistake of being honest. I sat my parents down and told them what I wanted to do. I had a plan. I had researched costs, scholarship options, typical career paths. I had a binder. I thought if I came in prepared, if I showed them I wasn't being flighty, they would hear me out. My father closed the binder without opening it. He told me that cooking was not a career. He told me that culinary school was for people who had no other options. He used the phrase, throwing good money after bad, 3 times in the same conversation even though I hadn't asked him for money. I had a partial scholarship and was prepared to take out loans for the rest. He said if I chose that path, I was on my own. He didn't mean it as a threat. He meant it as a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat certainty he used for everything. My mother watched the conversation happen the way she always watched things happen in that house, like a bystander. She touched my hand once, briefly, and then folded her hands in her lap. I enrolled in culinary school 6 weeks later. I used the scholarship, took out the loans, and got a part-time job at a catering company to cover rent. My father did not help me move. My brother texted me once that first month to say, "Hope this chef thing works out," with a thumbs up emoji, which I think was his version of being supportive. I was on my own. And I want to be honest. The first year was genuinely hard. Not romantically hard. Not the kind of hard that makes a good montage. Just grinding, exhausting, humbling hard. I was sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 other women. I was on my feet for 8 to 10 hours a day at school, and then another 4 or 5 at my catering job. I was learning how to break down a whole chicken at the same time I was learning how to manage money for the first time in my life. I called my mother twice that first semester. She answered both times and kept the conversation short, like she was worried my father might walk in. I stopped calling after that. I graduated from culinary school 2 years later in the top 15% of my class. Nobody from my family came to graduation. I stood in that auditorium in my chef's whites and looked out at the rows of parents and siblings and friends, and I made a decision that day. I decided I was not going to waste any more energy waiting for them to show up. Not to graduation, not to anything. If they weren't coming, they weren't coming. I was 20 years old and I had a diploma and a job offer from a well-regarded restaurant in Pittsburgh, and that was enough to start with. The next several years were the kind of years that don't make for dramatic storytelling but are the whole point of the story. I worked at that Pittsburgh restaurant for 2 years as a line cook, kept my head down, learned everything I could from a head chef who had no patience for ego and high standards for everything else. I got promoted to sous chef. I saved money. I read every book I could find on restaurant management and finance. I moved to Nashville when I was 24 because a friend of mine from culinary school was opening a small place there and needed a sous chef she could trust, and Nashville's food scene was growing fast. I worked that job for 18 months, and during those 18 months I did something I had never let myself do before. I started designing my own menu in a notebook I kept in my apartment. Not for anything, just for myself. Dishes I actually wanted to cook, not adaptations of someone else's vision. A restaurant that felt like mine. I had no plan to open anything. It was just a notebook. Then the restaurant I was working at got a write-up in a national food magazine. I was mentioned by name twice. A local investor reached out to my boss, and during that conversation my name came up again, and 2 weeks later that investor called me directly. He had a property in the Gulch neighborhood, a former auto repair shop that had been sitting empty for a year. He wanted to put a restaurant there. He wanted to know if I had a concept. I showed him the notebook. We signed a partnership agreement 4 months later. I will not pretend that opening a restaurant was smooth or easy or that it went exactly the way I imagined. It did not. There were months during construction when I lay awake doing math that didn't add up. There were permit delays and contractor problems, and a week in January when the HVAC system failed during a cold snap and we had to push our opening back by 3 weeks. My investor was patient, which I was grateful for. But patience has limits, and I felt the edges of his every time we had a setback. We opened in April, on a Wednesday, because Wednesdays are slow and I wanted the kitchen to find its rhythm before the weekend. The first few weeks were modest, full tables but not packed, decent reviews, nothing that made the news. Then a food writer from a Nashville alt weekly came in on a Thursday night and ordered the short rib dish I had been most nervous about, and she wrote about it in a way that made me cry in my car on the way home. Not sad crying. The other kind. By our 6th month, we had a wait list on weekends. By the end of year 1, we had been written up in 3 publications and named one of Nashville's best new restaurants by a local magazine. I hired a full team of 12. I was 28 years old. I had been in Nashville for almost 4 years by then and had not spoken to my father in all of that time. My mother called once, maybe 18 months after I'd moved. A short, careful call where she asked how I was doing without really asking, if that makes sense. Like she was fulfilling an obligation. I told her I was fine and asked how she was, and she said fine too, and we stayed on the line for a moment in silence before she said she had to go. I think about that call sometimes. I think about all the things that were in that silence that neither of us said. My brother had gotten married somewhere in there. I found out through Facebook, which I barely used. I was not invited to the wedding. I told myself it didn't hurt. I'm not sure I believed myself. The restaurant's 2nd year was the year things really changed. We expanded into the space next door, nearly doubling our capacity. We started a Sunday brunch service that became its own thing. There were lines out the door by 10 in the morning. A regional food and travel show reached out about featuring us in an episode. We did it. The episode aired in the spring, and the week after it aired, my phone didn't stop ringing. I was standing in my kitchen, my actual kitchen, in the house I was renting at the time, when I got a call from a number I didn't recognize with an Ohio area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. It was my mother. She didn't start with hello. She said, "Sweetheart, I saw the show." And then she paused, and in that pause I could hear all 7 years. I said, "Hi, Mom." She said the food looked beautiful. She said she was proud of me. She started crying somewhere around the third sentence, and I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and staring at the backsplash and feeling something I couldn't name. Not warm, not cold. Somewhere in between. Like when you're outside in February and the sun comes out for a minute and you feel it on your face but the air is still freezing. I let her talk. I didn't say much. At the end of the call, she asked if she and my father could come visit. She said my father had seen the show too. She said he wanted to come. I said I needed some time to think about it. I gave myself 2 weeks. I talked to my therapist, who I had been seeing since Nashville, and I talked to my best friend who had known me since culinary school and who had heard every version of this story in real time. My therapist said what therapists say, that I got to decide what I wanted, that whatever I decided was valid. My friend said, if you let them come, go in with your eyes open. That's the version that stuck. I called my mother back and told her they could visit the restaurant. Not my house. The restaurant. On a Saturday afternoon before service, when I would be on my turf and my team would be around. I told her I needed the visit to be on my terms. She agreed immediately, which surprised me a little. They arrived on a Saturday in October. I was in the kitchen running through prep when my hostess came to get me, and I walked out into the dining room and saw them standing near the host stand. And my first thought, genuinely, was that they looked smaller than I remembered. My father had gone gray. My mother was holding her purse with both hands. My brother was there too, which I had not been told about, and standing next to him was his wife, who I had never met. My father looked at the room, the exposed brick, the custom light fixtures, the open kitchen I had designed myself. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he turned to me and said, "This is really something." I said, "I know." My mother hugged me before I could decide whether I wanted to be hugged. She smelled the same, which hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I held myself still. We sat down at a table I had reserved, and I had my team bring out food. Not the whole menu, but a few things I was proud of. My father ate everything. He didn't speak much during the meal, which was normal for him, but he ate with what I can only describe as attention. Like he was actually tasting it. Toward the end of the meal, my brother said something that I had been waiting 7 years to hear from someone in that family. He said, I should have said something back then. When Dad said what he said, I should have pushed back. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at the table. I was a coward about it. I let that sit for a second. Then I said, yeah, you were. I didn't say it to be cruel. I said it because it was true and because I had spent 7 years not saying the true things and I was done with that. My brother nodded. He didn't argue. My father was quiet for a long moment after that. Then he said something that I had genuinely never expected to hear from him. He said I was wrong about the school. He said it once, flat, the way he said everything. But he said it. I looked at him and I thought about the binder he hadn't opened. I thought about the newspaper clipping I had taped to the inside of my closet door. I thought about standing in my chef's whites in that auditorium with an empty seat where my family should have been. And then I thought about the notebook I had kept in my Nashville apartment just for myself. Because I had learned to stop waiting for permission. I said, I know you were. Not warm. Not forgiving exactly. Not yet. That's a slower thing than an afternoon can hold. But I said it without anger, which surprised me, because somewhere between culinary school and that dining room, I had stopped being angry. Not because what happened was okay. It wasn't. But because anger was something I used to carry and at some point I had set it down, and I didn't want to pick it back up just because they were in the room. After they left, I stood in the empty dining room for a few minutes before service started. My sous chef poked her head out of the kitchen and raised an eyebrow at me, and I shook my head in a way that meant later, and she disappeared back through the door. I looked at the room I had designed, in the city I had chosen, in the career I had built when someone told me to build something else instead. And I thought about what it had taken to get there. Not the accolades, not the reviews, the actual thing. The 2 years sharing an apartment with 3 people. the 4 to 5 hour shifts after 8 hours of school, the 3 weeks of permit delays in January, the HVAC and a cold snap. The night I sat in my car in the parking lot of the restaurant and wondered if I had made a mistake, and then went home and got up the next morning and went back. None of that had anything to do with them. Not with my father's approval or my brother's silence or my mother's careful short phone calls. It was mine. Every brick of it was mine. I walked back into the kitchen and told my team we had 45 minutes to service and let's make it a good one. We did. I keep thinking about my father's face when he walked into that dining room for the first time. Not the words he said, just his face, the way his eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in everything, and how for once he had nothing to say immediately. That moment told me something I hadn't fully understood before. The life you build in silence, without anyone watching, without anyone cheering. That life speaks louder than any argument you could have ever won at a kitchen table. I don't believe things happen for a reason in some cosmic, predetermined way. But I do believe that how you respond to what happens to you, that part is yours entirely. When my father closed that binder without opening it, he made a choice. And when I enrolled in culinary school 6 weeks later anyway, I made one too. Every single thing that followed came out of those two choices, branching forward in time. Cause and effect, nothing more mysterious than that. He chose dismissal. I chose to keep moving. And 7 years later, we were both living inside the consequences of those choices. What I know now is that the restaurant didn't happen because I was talented enough or lucky enough, though both of those things played a part. It happened because I kept going on the days when stopping would have been easier. There were a lot of those days. The catering shifts after 8 hours of school. The January the HVAC failed. The night I sat in my car in the parking lot wondering if I had read the whole situation wrong. On every one of those days, I made a decision that had nothing to do with my father's approval. I just decided that the version of me who quit was not someone I was willing to become. That kind of stubbornness, the quiet, grinding kind, is something nobody can give you, and nobody can take away. I had to find it myself, and I found it in the years when I had no audience. And there was something else I had to develop, something harder than the grinding, the ability to think clearly when everything felt uncertain. Reading the books on restaurant finance late at night, designing a menu in a notebook that nobody asked for, saying yes to an investor because I had done the work to know my own concept was sound. Intelligence isn't just what you're born with. It's what you build when you're forced to figure things out without a safety net. My family's withdrawal, as painful as it was, removed every option except thinking for myself. That turned out to be the most valuable thing they could have done for me, even though they did it by accident. The hardest part, the part I'm still working on, is the integrity piece. Not the dramatic kind, not standing up in a room and making a speech. The quiet kind, telling my brother, yeah, you were, when he admitted he'd been a coward, without dressing it up or softening it into nothing. Letting my father's apology land without either rejecting it or pretending it erased everything. Holding both things at once, the hurt and the willingness to eventually sit across from them again, without collapsing one into the other. That's harder than opening a restaurant. That's the work that doesn't end. My mother smelled the same when she hugged me. I wasn't ready for that. I stood there in my own dining room and felt 7 years compress into about 4 seconds, and I let myself feel it without running from it, which is something I couldn't have done when I was 20. The person who walked back into that kitchen afterward, the one who told her team they had 45 minutes to service, she was made out of all of it. The newspaper clipping taped to the inside of a closet door, the empty seat at graduation. The notebook nobody asked to see. I wouldn't trade any of it, not even the hard parts, especially not those.